June 23, 1941, near Grodno, Western Front. Morning mist clung to the fields like smoke from a dying fire. The German 6th Panzer Division advanced in tight formation, grey columns of Panzerseries and IVs rumbling across the Polish border into the Soviet Union. Engines growled, treads crushed the wet soil, and the soldiers laughed. The invasion of the East, Operation Barbarossa, was unfolding with the precision of a machine. They expected chaos. Instead, they found silence. The men had grown used to victory. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The Low Countries barely slowed them down. The Wehrmacht moved with arrogance, confident that nothing built east of Berlin could possibly stand in their way. But in the tree line ahead, something moved. At first it seemed ordinary, just another Soviet tank withdrawing through the haze. Its silhouette was low, almost crude. But as it rolled closer, it became clear. This was no clumsy relic of the 1930s. The machine was bigger, its armor sloped like a fortress wall, its turret smooth and rounded. A dark green specter rising from the mist. Wine newer type was this Das. One German gunner muttered through his periscope. A new type, what is that? The commander squinted. Führerfrei! The Panzer T-37 Nendrid gun barked. The shell struck the enemy tank dead center, then ricocheted away with a sharp metallic scream. The crew stared in disbelief. Another shot followed. Again it bounced. Sparks. Smoke. No penetration. Then the reply came. A flash erupted from the Soviet turret, and the German tank's world turned white-hot. The T-34's 76.2 Merv gun punched through the Panzer's thin armor as if it were paper. Flames burst from the engine deck. The German commander never saw the hit. Across the field, other crews were shouting into their radios, voices breaking through static. Unser Gestos prallen ab. Our shells are bouncing off. The laughter was gone now. Panic replaced it. The unstoppable blitzkrieg had met something that did not yield. By noon, the German advance had stalled in that sector. Black smoke columns rose into the pale sky, mixing with the smell of burning oil and the acrid tang of cordite. What had been an easy morning push became a nightmare of ambushes and shattered confidence. One Soviet crewman, his face streaked with soot, leaned out of his hatch, watching the wreckage burn. His voice was calm, almost detached. They thought we were weak. Let them learn. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht felt the weight of a new kind of enemy, a machine born not of luxury or theory, but of necessity and endurance. A tank forged in factories far from comfort, designed by men who knew the land they would fight on. The field fell silent except for the crackle of fire. The air was thick with disbelief. The Germans had crossed into Russia expecting to roll over a broken army. Instead, they had met steel that refused to break. And on that gray morning, under the indifferent eastern sky, the myth of invincibility began to die. The sound of ricocheting shells would echo in their memory long after the smoke had cleared. Before the first T-34 ever rolled into battle, the Wehrmacht's confidence was absolute. Their panzers had conquered half of Europe in less than 2 years. Their doctrine of blitzkrieg, fast, coordinated assaults using tanks, infantry, and aircraft, had crushed everything in its path. To German officers, Soviet armor was nothing more than outdated steel, thinly plated, slow and blind. Reports from pre-war intelligence painted a comforting picture. The Red Army's tanks were primitive and poorly handled. The Germans laughed at the boxy BT-7s and T-26 paraded in Moscow. Even their higher-ups dismissed Soviet engineering as quantity over quality. They had no idea that deep in Kharkov and Nizhny Tagil, Soviet engineers had been working in silence on something radically different. A tank that could endure Russia's brutal winters, cross mud and snow without bogging down, and shrug off the very guns that gave Germany its edge. That machine was the T-34. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 20, 1941, over 3 million German troops surged across a 800-mile front. Behind them came 300-400 panzers, mostly light and medium models Panzer II with a 20 mm cannon, barely capable of piercing 30 mm of armor. Panzer III, the workhorse of the invasion, armed with a 37 mm gun. Panzer IV, the heaviest at the time, with a short-barreled 7mm gun for infantry support. Not tank duels. Against the older Soviet armor, these machines were devastating. Entire Soviet divisions collapsed in days. Thousands of tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel or repair parts. To the German crews, it confirmed everything they believed: the Red Army was a paper tiger. Then came the first encounters with the T-34 and its heavier cousin, the KV-1. Initial sightings near Minsk, Dubno, and Smolensk sent ripples of disbelief through German lines. Reports arrived describing tanks with sloped armor, wide tracks, and powerful 76.2 mm guns, vehicles that German shells could not penetrate even at close range. Commanders dismissed these claims as exaggeration or battlefield confusion, until the wrecks of Panzerkreuzer and IV units began piling up beside them. One German officer, Lieutenant General Hermann Hoth, later wrote, "The appearance of the T-34 marked the beginning of a new era in tank warfare. Our weapons were suddenly inadequate." The German High Command had underestimated not just the machine, but the nation that built it. The Soviet Union, though chaotic and wounded, possessed something the Wehrmacht had not accounted for: depth, in manpower, in territory, and in willpower. The Soviets built tanks like they built their cities: functional, resilient, and meant to endure suffering. Each T-34 was a blunt message to the invader: you may advance, but you will pay for every kilometer in blood and steel. By the end of the summer, whispers spread through German tank regiments. The men spoke of a ghost tank that shrugged off shells, that appeared through the mist and vanished into the woods. They gave it a name spoken with frustration and respect: Der russische Teufelpanzer, the Russian devil tank. In Berlin, generals began asking hard questions. How could a so-called backward nation produce something superior to Germany's best? In Moscow, meanwhile, engineers and soldiers already knew the answer. The T-34 was not designed for show. It was designed for survival. In the fields of the East, a quiet shift was beginning. The hunter had met its match, and as the summer of 1941 burned on, that match would ignite a fire that neither army could extinguish. Every legend begins with disbelief. To understand why the T-34 terrified the Wehrmacht, one must look not at the battlefield first, but at the factory floor. It was born not from luxury or precision, but from desperation and genius. In 1937, at the Kharkov Comintern locomotive plant, a quiet man named Mikhail Koshkin was given an impossible order by the Red Army's tank directorate: build a tank that could survive Russia itself. It had to move across swamps and snow, shrug off artillery fragments, and fight with power and simplicity. The Soviet Union did not have the resources for complexity, so they built for endurance. The result was the T-34 Model 1940, a machine whose soul was forged in function. It began with the armor. Instead of the vertical plates common to European tanks, Koshkin's team angled every surface. The T-34's 45 mm thick armor, when sloped at 60 degrees, offered protection equivalent to nearly twice its thickness. Enemy rounds didn't just strike, it glanced off. This single decision changed tank warfare forever. Under its sloped skin beat a new kind of heart: the V2 diesel engine. At 500 horsepower, it gave the 26-ton tank a top speed of nearly 33 miles per hour, astonishing for its weight. More importantly, the diesel reduced the risk of fire, a death sentence for most gasoline-driven tanks. German crews, whose panzers often turned into burning coffins after one hit, would envy this feature bitterly. And then, the tracks, wide and rugged, they carried the T-34 across the mud and frozen rivers that swallowed German machines whole. When the autumn rains came and the Russian steppe turned into a sea of mud, the T-34 kept moving. The Germans called it Rasputitsa, the season of impassable roads. The Soviets called it home ground. Its armament was equally formidable. The L-11 and later F-34 76.2 mm fired high-velocity rounds capable of punching through any German tank of 1941. With an effective range beyond 1,000 meters, a skilled gunner could kill before the enemy closed to firing distance. And yet, for all its power, the T-34 was not a luxury craft. Its interior was cramped, its visibility poor, its gearbox rough and unforgiving. Crews often had to wrestle it into gear with hammers. But they forgave its brutality because it stayed alive. One Soviet tanker later said, "She was like a wild horse. Hard to control, but she would never abandon you." The Germans, by contrast, had built tanks like fine watches, precise, complex, beautiful, and fragile. The T-34 was a hammer, and on the vast anvil of the Eastern Front, Hammers survive longer than watches. But it wasn't just a machine, it was a doctrine. The Red Army didn't view tanks as individual dueling knights, but as a storm of steel. The T-34 was designed for mass deployment, thousands moving as one, overwhelming by presence rather than finesse. Soviet field manuals emphasized mobility, shock, and persistence. If one tank fell, another rolled forward. By 1942, German intelligence estimated that the Soviets were producing over 200 T-34s per month, numbers that defied logic. Even when factories were relocated east of the Urals, production never stopped. Workers slept beside their machines, welding turrets by lantern light as Luftwaffe bombs fell outside. The T-34 became not just a weapon, but a symbol of national will, iron in both form and spirit. When German crews first encountered them, they were stunned not just by its resilience, but by its simplicity. Field reports captured their disbelief. The T-34 is vastly superior to our tanks. We require immediate development of new weapons. German Army Ordnance Department, November 1941. The panic was justified. For the first time since the war began, German technology was behind. By the winter of 1941, as snow buried the corpses of summer's ambition, the myth of German technical supremacy had begun to crack. The Wehrmacht had entered the East armed with arrogance. The Soviets met them with engineering that did not bend and doctrine that did not die. In the heart of steel there was defiance. In every weld, a promise: we will outlast you. October 6, 1941, near Mtsensk, east of Oral. A grey dawn crept over the Russian steppe as frost glittered on the grass. The 4th Panzer Division of General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army pushed forward, engines growling in the bitter air. Operation Typhoon, the grand drive toward Moscow, was in full swing. Victory seemed near inevitable. Then the road ahead erupted in fire. From the birch woods flanking the road, shapes began to move, low, angular silhouettes emerging through the mist. T-34s, dozens of them. They came not in panic, but with cold precision. At their head was Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Lavrinenko, a young Soviet officer commanding the 1st Guards Tank Brigade under General Mikhail Katukov. His orders were simple: delay the Germans at all costs. The battle that followed would become legend. The German spearhead, composed mainly of Panzerhussars and IVs, opened fire first. Shells screamed across the field, striking the T-34s with hollow clangs. Sparks leapt from their sloped armor, then died in the cold wind. Not a single tank was knocked out. Lavrinenko's voice cracked through the radio. "Gunners, 500 meters! Fire!" The T-34s replied with thunder. Their 76.2 Mon rounds ripped through German armor like paper. A Panzer burst into flames, its turret spinning into the air. Another exploded from a direct hit to its ammunition rack. Gun camera film from surviving German tanks captured the chaos, burning vehicles littering the field, black smoke curling into the sky, and the eerie calm of the Soviet advance, unstoppable, methodical, precise. Inside one Panzer, a radio operator screamed over the static, "They are impervious?" The shells bounce off them like stones. But for the first time, seasoned German tankers felt helpless. Their doctrine, built on speed, coordination, and firepower, collapsed against armor that refused to yield. Katukov's brigade fought like a ghost army. They struck, vanished, then struck again. T-34s used the terrain like living hunters, disappearing behind ridges, appearing on flanks, firing, and slipping away before the panzers could turn. When dusk fell, the battlefield lay silent except for the hiss of burning fuel. The 4th Panzer Division had lost dozens of tanks. The road to Moscow was littered with wreckage and twisted metal. General Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg himself, was forced to report the unthinkable. The Russian T-34 is the finest tank in the world. Lavrinenko and his crew had destroyed 15 German tanks in that single day. Over the next few months, he would raise that number to 52, becoming one of the most effective tank commanders of the war, before being killed in action in December 1941, aged just 27. His legend spread across Soviet lines like a spark in winter darkness. To the Red Army, he was proof that the invader could bleed. To the Wehrmacht, he was the face of a nightmare they could not kill. The Mtsensk battle changed everything. German commanders demanded urgent upgrades: long-barreled 50 new guns, thicker armor, new suspension systems. Hitler himself ordered the development of entirely new models, the Panther and the Tiger, machines born from fear of the T-34. In the diaries of German officers, the tone shifted from pride to dread. The Russian tank can climb where ours cannot. It can cross mud where ours sink. We fight as if against the earth itself. That autumn, as snow began to fall and engines froze in the cold, the Wehrmacht realized the truth. The road to Moscow was not paved with victory. It was paved with wrecked panzers and echoes of ricocheting shells. The hunter had become the hunted. By the winter of 1941, the Wehrmacht had learned a bitter truth. Their once invincible panzer force had met an adversary it could neither outrun nor outgun. The T-34 haunted them. Every new engagement brought the same cruel lesson. Shells that failed to penetrate, trees that never bogged down, and a gun that tore through German armor like it was tin. On the radio nets of the Eastern Front, fear began to creep into coded chatter. Crews spoke of Geisterpanzer, ghost tanks that appeared from the fog, shrugged off fire, and vanished. The German response was swift but desperate. Orders poured from Berlin to the front line factories. Develop heavier armor, longer barrels, greater velocity. At first, the modifications were small. The Panzer III was upgunned with a 15 mm L60 cannon, capable of piercing 50 mm of armor at 500 meters, but only on the T-34's thinner side plates. The Panzer IV, once a close support tank, received a new long-barreled 7 Bunham KK-40 L43 gun, giving it a fighting chance at range. But even these improvements came too slowly. By the time they reached the field in mid-1942, thousands of German tank crews had already been lost to the same haunting phrase, "Unser Geschoss prellen ab," our shells bounce off. Meanwhile, the Soviets were evolving. The T-34-43 and T-34-85 models introduced refined armor, wider turrets, and new three-man crews that improved communication and reaction time. Factories east of the Urals, safe from Luftwaffe bombers, churned out tanks with a rhythm that bordered on madness. 300 T-34s a month, then 500, then 2,000. Even as Moscow burned and Stalingrad blood, production never faltered. One German intelligence report from 1942 captured the growing despair. Each time we destroy a Russian tank regiment, two more appear. They do not stop. They do not tire. The battlefield dynamic shifted. Where once the panzers had encircled their prey, now they were the ones surrounded. Overwhelmed by sheer volume and resilience, German tank aces like Otto Carius and Ernst Bachmann would later describe the T-34 as the ever-present shadow of the Eastern Front. Carius recalled, "You could hear them before you saw them. A deep rumbling like thunder rolling over the horizon. You'd fire and fire again, and when the dust cleared, they were still coming." By late 1942, the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee air superiority, and German logistics strained to the breaking point. Winter set in again, an enemy more loyal to the Soviets than any army. The T-34 thrived in it. Its diesel engine roared even at 30 degrees C. Its wide tracks glided over frozen terrain where German tanks stood paralyzed. Soviet crews fought in sheepskin coats, singing old folk songs over the roar of engines, while German divisions starved and froze around them. The myth of blitzkrieg was gone. What replaced it was a grinding war of attrition, and the T-34 was its beating heart. When word of the Mitsensk battle reached Hitler's headquarters, rage turned to obsession. He demanded new weapons, monsters that would reclaim German prestige. The result was the Panther and the Tiger, tanks born not from strategy but from fear. Each weighed nearly twice the T-34, bristling with thick armor and massive guns. But with that power came fragility. The Panther's transmission cracked under strain. The Tiger's fuel consumption crippled mobility. While formidable, they were too few, too late, and too complex for a nation now bleeding dry. In the meantime, the Soviets kept their creed: simple: build, replace, advance. A Soviet engineer at Factory No. 183 put it bluntly, "For every one of theirs, we will make 10. For every 10 they destroy, we will send 20 more." By 1943, the Eastern Front echoed with the growl of thousands of T-34s. German crews no longer laughed when they saw them. They prayed their shells would find a weak point. Fear had replaced arrogance, and respect had replaced disbelief. July 5, 1943. Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. The dawn sky pulsed red from the horizon. not from sunrise, but from artillery fire. Nearly 6,000 tanks converged across the rolling fields of the Kursk salient, dust, smoke, and thunder forming a single, endless roar. The Germans came with everything they had left: elite SS Panzer divisions, brand new Panthers and Tigers, and Luftwaffe squadrons screaming overhead. It was meant to be their redemption, a counterstrike to crush the Red Army and restore their dominance. But waiting for them, dug in along ridges and wheat fields, were thousands of T-34s. The Soviets had prepared for months. Engineers built 3,000 miles of trenches, 500,000 mines, and anti-tank belts designed to absorb the German assault. When the Wehrmacht charged, they ran headfirst into the strongest defense ever constructed on the Eastern Front. At Prokhorovka, the two armored tides collided in a storm of metal and fire. T-34s charged through clouds of smoke, closing to point-blank range where the Tigers' long guns couldn't track fast enough. The battlefield dissolved into chaos, crews firing over open sights, ramming, burning, fighting until turrets melted from heat. It was as if the earth itself had caught fire, recalled Soviet tanker Ivan Krasnov. We drove straight into them. Our world was red and steel and thunder. For the first time, German tank superiority, hard-won through engineering, met its true nemesis: numbers, mobility, and willpower. The T-34s struck from every direction, like waves against cliffs, and though they fell in hundreds, the cliffs began to crumble. A Luftwaffe pilot later described the scene from above. We saw the T-34s crawling across the plain in endless rows. When one burned, two more came through the smoke. By the battle's end, the German offensive was shattered. Hitler's dream of regaining initiative in the east died in the wheat fields of Kursk. From that day onward, the Wehrmacht would never again take the offensive. From Kursk to the Vistula, from Smolensk to Berlin, the T-34 became the hammer of the Red Army. In 1944 alone, Soviet factories produced 15,000 new tanks, the majority T-34s. Entire armored armies advanced in coordinated waves, their formations a moving sea of iron. German soldiers coined a new phrase, T-34 shock. It was a psychological collapse, a deep dread that came from hearing the rumble of diesel engines beyond the fog. Veterans described how the sound rolled over the earth before the tanks even appeared. One Wehrmacht diary entry found after the war reads, "When we hear them, we already know how it ends. There is no escape from the Russian tank." By 1944, German defenses were no longer lines, they were graves waiting to be filled. The T-34-85, fitted with an 85 1-riv gun, could now duel Tiger's head on and win. Its silhouette dominated both battlefield and propaganda, painted on banners, posters, and even children's storybooks. It was no longer just a tank. It was the symbol of survival. When the Red Army reached the outskirts of Berlin in April 1945, the city trembled beneath the thunder of their treads. Columns of T-34s rolled through shattered streets where once the righteous parades had marched. One German civilian wrote, "They came like ghosts of the men we sent east." The sound of their engines was the sound of revenge. The T-34 had done what no machine before it could: carry an entire nation from the brink of annihilation to the gates of victory. For every Tiger that roared, a dozen T-34s answered. For every shell that bounced, a memory burned into German hearts: steel cannot conquer spirit. In the sky, the Luftwaffe no longer ruled. On the ground, the T-34 owned the world. Behind every T-34 that roared into battle was a miracle not of luxury, but of endurance. A nation that turned its entire existence into a weapon. In 1941, as the Wehrmacht advanced deep into Soviet territory, over 500 factories were dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto trains, and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains. It was an evacuation without precedent in human history. Entire cities vanished from maps, reborn thousands of kilometers away under snow and smoke. At Nizhny Tagil, Chelyabinsk, and Omsk, new industrial cities rose overnight, grim, immense, and alive. The men and women who built them worked through air raids, hunger, and blizzards. Children hauled rivets, mothers welded turrets, engineers slept beside molten furnaces. A factory worker named Tayana Andreeva wrote in her diary, "We built tanks with our hands bleeding. Each one we finished was one more that would come back to us in victory." By 1942, the Soviet Union had achieved what no other nation could: mass mechanized resurrection. Production surged. T-34s built in 1940 wanted 200 T-34s built in 1900 T-34s built in 1943 15 734s built in 1940. Over 15,000 more by war's end. The USSR had produced over 57,000 T-34s, an avalanche of steel that drowned the German war machine. The Germans could not compete. The Tiger I, formidable but intricate, required 300,000 man-hours to construct. A T-34 took half that time. While German factories struggled under Allied bombing, Soviet plants operated ceaselessly, day and night, powered by human endurance and diesel smoke. We lose one, it's gone forever. A German logistics officer wrote in late 1943. They lose 10 and send 20 more. The efficiency bordered on the brutal. The Uralvagonzavod plant in Nizhny Tagil alone produced 40% of all T-34s built during the war. Its assembly lines never stopped. New tanks rolled straight out of the factory doors, often driven directly to the front by factory workers themselves. Some even went into battle unpainted, still smelling of oil and hot steel. Propaganda films showed young women in suit, covered overalls saluting as their creations rolled past. For the motherland, they whispered, watching their machines disappear into the snow. The T-34 wasn't just a tank anymore. It was a symbol of collective defiance, the beating heart of an industrial colossus that refused to die. While the Reich dwindled under shortages and sabotage, the Soviets thrived on ruthless simplicity. Their logistics were efficient, their supply chains vast, and their strategy brutally pragmatic. Quantity has a quality all its own. When the Red Army crossed the Vistula in 1944, entire tank armies advanced with synchronized precision. Thousands of T-34s fueled, armed, and repaired in record time. German resistance dissolved not from lack of courage, but from exhaustion. A Wehrmacht field commander near Warsaw wrote in despair, "Will you kill 1 and 3 take its place? Their tanks come in waves. It is not war, it is an avalanche." And it truly was, an avalanche of steel, smoke, and human will. From the cold furnaces of the Urals to the rubble of Berlin, the Soviet industrial machine became unstoppable. Its rhythm measured not in hours or days, but in victories per kilometer. Each T-34 carried not just armor and firepower, but the heartbeat of a nation that refused to surrender. Berlin, May 1945. The city lies in ruins. Smoke curls through the shattered Reichstag. On the steps, beneath a red flag flapping in the wind, a single T-34-85 stands motionless, its armor scorched, its tracks caked with dust and blood. Around it, silence. 4 years earlier, German officers had laughed at this machine. They called it a tractor with a gun. They saw crude welds, rough armor, and dismissed it as inferior Slavic steel. Now it stood at the gates of their empire, the final witness to the end of their war. In the aftermath, Allied engineers from Britain, America, and Germany studied the T-34. They found its design almost primitive, yet devastatingly effective. The Christie suspension, the sloped armor, the diesel engine, all optimized for mass production and battlefield survival. It was not a tank designed to impress. It was a tank designed to endure. A U.S. Army report in 1945 concluded, in simplicity of design and tactical effectiveness, the T-34 is the outstanding tank of this war. But for the men who fought in them, the T-34 was more than metal. It was life itself. A veteran from the 5th Guards Tank Army, years later, recalled through trembling hands, when you were inside the T-34, you felt like part of something immortal. We buried friends inside these machines, and still they kept moving forward. And so, the legend grew, from Stalingrad's ruins to the streets of Prague, from post-war parades to museum halls. Even decades later, in rusted silence under museum lights, the T-34 seems alive. The armor still bears the scars of ricocheted shells, the echoes of diesel thunder. Schoolchildren run their fingers over its cold steel and read the plaque beneath, T-34, the tank that saved a nation. By the 1950s, the T-34 had become the symbol of victory, exported, copied, and revered across continents. From Korea to the Middle East, its silhouette became a sign of resilience, its legacy outliving the empire that birthed it. In Soviet memory, it was myth and memory intertwined, the machine that turned the tide, the tank that carried the weight of a nation's suffering and its revenge. For the Wehrmacht, it had begun with laughter, but history silenced that laughter with steel. Shells that once bounced off its armor became symbols of futility, of underestimation shattered by reality. And in the quiet after the storm, as the world rebuilt itself from ashes, one truth remained etched into time. The Wehrmacht laughed at Soviet T-34s until they realized their shells just bounced off. The laughter faded. The thunder remained.